You're listening to Digi City, a cyberpunk story in 8 parts. Written by Jarrett Rush and produced by SciFi in cooperation with the author. Part 3. Miller slammed the heel of his boot onto the top of Echo's hand. Bone crunched. "Where's Chris?" Echo twisted himself into a tighter pretzel. He was face down on the ground. Miller pressed a knee into Echo's back and pulled on his left arm, lifting Echo's chest off the ground. The grimace let Miller know he was doing a good job. "I don't know," Echo said. "I haven't seen him in a couple of days." They were on the 3rd floor of Tallboy. It was the one floor that hadn't been stripped bare. Sheetrock walls still separated the space into a dozen offices. This floor was set aside for those still ashamed of their addiction. They'd find space in one of the offices, grab a spot along a wall and plug in. They'd pass out in private, burning away all their cares but getting to keep their dignity. Miller pulled harder on Echo's arm, twisting him farther. "I think you're lying. Why should I trust a data rat like you? Coming in here and taking advantage of these guys. Can't defend themselves, can't chase you down after you're done going through their pockets. I swear, Echo whimpered. "He hasn't been here in a couple days. Not here. Not any of the houses I go to." Miller let go of Echo's arm, and he fell to the floor, cracking his chin on the concrete. Blood started to pool. Miller wiped his hands on a handkerchief he pulled from his pocket, then dropped it near Echo's face. "Clean yourself up." Echo didn't know where Chris was. Miller knew that from almost the beginning, but it was worth it to twist him up some. Never know what you'd find out. Maybe nothing about Chris, but maybe something that would lead Miller there. Miller took a deep breath once he was outside Tallboy. The workers at the docks were loud. The crowd outside Tallboy and in the rest of Digi City was thick. No matter how many times he heard this place referred to as Digi City, and that's all crews ever called it, it would always be the Berenson complex to Miller. Before New Eden became New Eden. Before everything fell apart. Back when Roma was just another company that made a little of everything but specialized in nothing. Its chief competitor was Berenson. This was the company's corporate home. One tall building in the back. 2 low-slung buildings in the front. A courtyard in between covered in paver stones, with a large fountain right in the center. Miller passed by here a dozen times a week when he was a cop working a beat. He still saw the Berenson sign hanging from the top floor of the building, the company name written in an overly elaborate blue script. He heard the jingle sung at the end of every commercial. For the home and the family, Berenson. Performed by a collection of middle-tone voices, pronouncing the company name in 3 distinct syllables, holding on to the last just a second longer than the first 2. Berenson was an old company, family-owned. No one knew how fragile things were behind that logo sign until things began changing in New Eden, and people started voting with their hearts instead of their heads, ushering in a government built more on ideals than experience. That's when Berenson started wobbling. Once the economy started changing and people didn't spend what they once did, the company fell over for good. TV crews had crowded the courtyard trying to get moving pictures of teary-eyed employees carrying a lifetime of work in cardboard boxes. Miller, then a cop, made sure some overzealous newsman didn't overstep his bounds. He was stationed in the courtyard, near the fountain. It took everyone 2 days to evacuate all 3 buildings. Miller watched it all. Then he watched the rest of the neighborhood quickly fade. The restaurants and shops closed first, because the Berenson employees weren't around to support them. The other small businesses that open in the shadows of a large company didn't last much longer, either closing for good or moving into some other company's shadow. Within a year, the neighborhood was essentially abandoned. Miller looked into empty shops. He checked locks on doors that would never open again. Eventually, Miller looked in the windows less frequently. He checked those locks less often. And that was the opening the other element in New Eden needed. That element turned the main Berenson building into Tallboy and the other smaller buildings into Demon and Doughboy. Both of the other buildings were gutted, then jammed with so much cable that the walls practically popped. demon had speed. Its feed was hot, running over those who didn't expect it like a truck, flattened. Doughboy didn't have demon speed, but its feed was magnitudes more stout, a mix of clean data and dirty data, that left most people piles of drool and muscle by the end. It left some worse. And the area between the buildings, the entry covered by paver stones and home to Miller's familiar fountain, was now called the Wasteland. The fountain was tall and wide, a large circular pool. A statue of a man rose from the center, one arm extended high above him. Large, long sheets of canvas ran from the top of the statue to the second floor of each of the smaller buildings. It was a makeshift cover that provided at least a bit of protection from the weather. The canvas protected more than the people. It also protected the equipment, servers specifically. The crew running Digi City left no space unused. They ran cheap servers and worn cables all across the paver stones and charged $5 for a dirty fix. The data coming through wasn't clean, and the freaks hooking in for a quick fix left. More broken than when they'd plugged in, a small part of them literally burned away. But for that $5 and a pound of flesh, they got to forget for a few minutes. A fair trade for addicts who were broke or so far gone that they were focused on the destination and not how they got there. Miller stood by the fountain and looked over the bodies stretched out on the ground in front of him. Chris wouldn't be here, he told himself. He hoped. The wasteland was where the desperate came. Chris wasn't desperate. Not yet. Miller worked his way back through the crowd, catching some of these addicts hard enough with his boot that he should have woken them. They didn't budge, lost in empty dreams of nothing. Miller walked to the smaller hothouses that had sprung up around Digi City. Some were there to handle the overflow crowds or provide a discount to the cheap fixes that were already available. Others offered a finer level of service. They'd give a chair or mat instead of the hard floor. Or they'd offer guaranteed clean data so the damage of a fix would be limited. Others even promised a unique data experience that would leave the user refreshed and renewed. The only way to do data, they said. Miller started closest in, the discount shops. The freaks had a funk, and it had already soaked into the walls of the first shop. It was a mix of sweat, cheap alcohol, and herb. The smell hit Miller before he opened the door. Blackout curtains hung in the windows and the lights inside were dim. A kid sitting at a counter near the door hit Miller with the beam from a flashlight. He put his hands up in front of his eyes and turned. He felt the gun in his waistband shift. "Help you?" the kid asked. "Not looking to plug in, just looking for a face." The kid paused, looked across the floor. No more than a couple dozen people plugged in. He turned back to Miller. "Make it quick." The place was small, just a single floor that was longer than it was wide. Cables spilled from the ceiling, forming a curtain that divided the space in half. Miller made a quick loop, praying that he wouldn't see Chris's face. A sigh of relief, a nod to the kid at the counter, and back to the street. Miller paused and considered right or left when his phone vibrated in his pocket. A message from Cruz. "Come in, I've got another name."